The moment you believe you already know the truth is often the moment you stop looking for it. A sharp crash shattered the quiet morning outside the Northgate Corporate Security Campus in Dallas, Texas, sending startled employees turning toward the visitor parking area as the sound echoed across the polished glass buildings. Tiny fragments of tempered glass sparkled across the pavement beneath the driver's side window of a black luxury sport utility vehicle parked beside the security entrance. Standing only a few feet away was Marcus Brooks, a 43-year-old black man wearing a charcoal jacket over a crisp white button-down shirt. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply looked at the damaged window with calm, steady eyes before shifting his attention toward Officer Daniel Hayes. The white police officer stood beside the vehicle with a tense expression, convinced he had just acted to prevent a dangerous situation after receiving an urgent report about an unoccupied luxury vehicle that had remained in the same location for nearly 30 minutes. Employees gathering near the front entrance exchanged uncertain glances while several security guards paused their morning patrols. Office workers carrying coffee slowed their pace, and a few quietly lifted their phones, trying to understand what had happened only moments earlier. Marcus folded his hands in front of him without the slightest sign of panic. His remarkable composure seemed almost out of place beside the shattered glass scattered across the asphalt. Daniel looked directly at him. "Sir, I need to know whether this vehicle belongs to you." Marcus answered calmly. "I am responsible for it this morning." Daniel studied his face for several seconds. "Responsible in what way?" Marcus briefly glanced toward the modern security headquarters across the parking lot before returning his attention to the officer. "That will become clear very soon." The answer sounded respectful, yet incomplete. Daniel frowned slightly. "I asked a direct question." Marcus nodded. "And I gave the most complete answer I can give right now." The growing crowd listened carefully. Nobody interrupted. Nobody seemed certain which side of the conversation made more sense. A gentle breeze carried the sound of flags moving above the corporate campus, while delivery trucks entered through the far security gate, and employees continued arriving for another ordinary workday. Everything about the morning felt routine except the damaged window of the expensive vehicle sitting quietly beneath the Texas sunlight. Daniel slowly looked through the broken opening into the interior. The leather seats were immaculate. A black access badge rested beside a leather portfolio on the center console. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing suggested criminal activity. Yet something still felt incomplete. Marcus never attempted to reach inside the vehicle. Instead, he remained exactly where he stood, maintaining a respectful distance while patiently watching the officer examine the situation. "Why were you waiting beside the vehicle?" Daniel asked. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Because I was instructed to remain with it until someone arrived." "Who?" Marcus offered the same calm expression. "The person expecting it." Daniel folded his arms. "Can you tell me who that is?" Marcus looked briefly at the digital clock displayed through the dashboard before answering. "In a few minutes, I will not need to." The response deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. Several employees quietly exchanged puzzled looks. One security officer standing near the entrance appeared ready to walk over before another gently signaled him to wait. Marcus noticed the exchange but remained silent. He checked the dashboard clock once more. 9:27. 3 minutes remained. His eyes then settled on the center display inside the vehicle. Without warning, the large digital screen illuminated across the dashboard. The incoming call notification appeared brightly enough for Daniel to see through the damaged window. Marcus made no attempt to answer it. He simply watched the screen for a brief moment before calmly returning his attention to the officer. The words glowing across the display instantly captured everyone's attention. "Head of Security calling." Marcus Brooks quietly watched the illuminated display until the incoming call disappeared, leaving the dashboard as calm as it had been only seconds before. He made no effort to climb into the vehicle or reach through the broken driver's side window. Instead, he folded his hands comfortably in front of him and returned his attention to Officer Daniel Hayes. The silence that followed seemed even louder than the sound that had shattered the peaceful morning only moments earlier. Daniel glanced once more through the damaged window toward the center display before looking directly at Marcus. "Someone called the head of security is trying to reach you," he said. Marcus answered calmly. "Yes. Would you like to return the call?" Marcus gently shook his head. "Not yet." Daniel frowned slightly. Why not? Marcus looked briefly toward the modern corporate headquarters standing across the parking lot, its polished glass reflecting the bright Texas sunlight. Because the person calling already knows exactly where I am. The answer only deepened Daniel's uncertainty. Then why would they keep calling? Marcus smiled politely without showing the slightest sign of frustration. To make sure everything remains on schedule. Several employees standing nearby quietly exchanged puzzled looks. The explanation sounded perfectly reasonable, yet it answered almost nothing. A security officer standing near the main entrance instinctively reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder before deciding to wait. Another employee carrying a laptop slowed to watch the conversation while pretending to answer a text message. The morning routine around the campus continued, but curiosity had quietly become part of the atmosphere. Daniel carefully studied Marcus. Throughout the entire encounter, he had not seen a single action that suggested panic or deception. Marcus answered every question respectfully. His movements remained slow and deliberate. His eyes never wandered nervously around the parking lot. Instead, they repeatedly returned to one place. The digital clock inside the vehicle. Daniel noticed the pattern. You have checked the time several times, he observed. Marcus nodded once. I have. Why? Marcus answered without hesitation. Because timing matters today. To whom? To the person expecting this vehicle. Daniel looked toward the black sport utility vehicle once more. The broken window allowed him to see the interior more clearly now. A neatly folded company access badge rested beside a leather portfolio. Everything inside appeared organized. Nothing suggested someone had been living in the vehicle or attempting to hide anything. He quietly noticed an electronic key fob resting in Marcus's hand. Those are the keys? Daniel asked. Marcus opened his hand slightly so the officer could see them clearly. Yes. You have had them this entire time. Yes. Why did you not tell me? Marcus answered with the same calm honesty. You did not ask. Daniel paused. The answer was technically correct. He had assumed Marcus possessed the keys only after seeing them. He had never actually asked. The realization lingered longer than he expected. A gentle breeze carried the sound of flags moving above the corporate campus, while another group of employees crossed the parking lot toward the main entrance. The digital clock changed from 9:27 to 9:28. Marcus quietly exhaled. 2 minutes remained. Daniel followed his gaze toward the dashboard again. Who exactly is coming? Marcus looked directly at him. Someone whose responsibility is much greater than mine. Can you give me a name? Marcus smiled faintly. You will not need to ask in a little while. Before Daniel could continue, the dashboard illuminated once more. The incoming call returned brighter than before. Head of security calling. Marcus remained perfectly still, making no attempt to answer. Instead, he quietly watched the screen until the call ended by itself. Daniel noticed that Marcus showed no disappointment when the display went dark again. Instead, there was quiet certainty in his expression, as though every unanswered call brought the morning exactly where it was supposed to go. Then Marcus looked toward the front entrance of the corporate headquarters. Several professionally dressed executives had just stepped through the glass doors into the bright morning sunlight, and one distinguished figure immediately began walking toward the parking area with calm, unmistakable purpose. Marcus Brooks followed the movement at the front entrance without changing his calm posture. Several executives exited the corporate headquarters carrying briefcases and electronic tablets, while security personnel politely held the glass doors open. The distinguished man walking in front of the group moved with quiet confidence rather than urgency, acknowledging employees with a simple nod as he crossed the plaza toward the visitor parking area. Marcus recognized him immediately. The timing matched the schedule perfectly. 9:28. Less than 2 minutes remained before the carefully planned meeting. Officer Daniel Hayes noticed Marcus watching the approaching executive, but saw nothing unusual. Do you know him? Daniel asked. Marcus answered honestly. Yes. Is he the person you have been waiting for? Marcus nodded once. He is. Daniel looked from Marcus to the approaching group. Then why not tell me his name? Marcus smiled politely. Because he should be the one to introduce himself. The answer lingered in the quiet morning air. Around them, employees continued slowing their pace. A maintenance worker paused beside a landscaped flower bed. 2 delivery drivers standing near the loading dock quietly watched from a distance. Even the campus security officers remained where they were, carefully observing without interfering. Marcus never seemed distracted by the growing audience. Instead, he glanced once more toward the digital clock visible through the windshield. 9:29. 1 minute remained. Daniel noticed the repeated glance. "You seem very certain about the timing," he observed. Marcus answered with complete confidence. "The schedule has been precise since the beginning." Daniel folded his arms thoughtfully. "Everything about you suggests you expected this entire situation." Marcus looked directly at him. "I expected the meeting. The misunderstanding was never part of the plan." The officer considered those words carefully. Nothing Marcus had said since the beginning had turned out to be false. Every answer had been truthful while still leaving important details unanswered. Daniel slowly looked through the broken driver's side window once more. The leather portfolio remained untouched on the center console beside the company access badge. The interior was spotless despite the damaged glass scattered across the driver's seat and pavement. Marcus had never attempted to recover anything from inside the vehicle. He simply continued waiting exactly where he had been standing before the officer arrived. "What is inside the portfolio?" Daniel asked. Marcus answered immediately. "Documents that need to be delivered. Important documents. Very important documents." Daniel almost smiled. "You have a remarkable way of answering questions without giving away everything." Marcus returned the smile politely. "Sometimes responsibility requires patience." A light breeze carried the sound of flags moving above the corporate campus as the approaching executive reached the edge of the parking area. Two members of the executive team quietly slowed their pace several steps behind him, allowing him to continue forward alone. Employees who recognized the executive immediately stepped aside with respectful greetings as he walked past. Daniel noticed those reactions, but still did not understand their significance. He quietly touched the radio on his shoulder, considering whether to update dispatch, before deciding to wait another moment. Something about Marcus's unwavering confidence suggested the situation was about to explain itself. The digital display inside the sport utility vehicle illuminated again. For the third time that morning, the same notification appeared across the center screen. "Head of security calling." Marcus did not move. He calmly watched the display until the call ended on its own. Then he slipped the electronic key fob into the palm of his hand, as though preparing for an arrival he had anticipated all along. Daniel followed his gaze once more. The distinguished executive had nearly reached them now. A warm expression crossed the man's face the instant he recognized Marcus standing beside the vehicle, and without hesitation he raised one hand in a familiar greeting before continuing directly toward the shattered driver's side window with complete confidence. The distinguished executive continued walking across the visitor parking area with calm confidence, acknowledging a few employees who greeted him along the way before directing his full attention toward Marcus Brooks. There was no uncertainty in his expression. He clearly expected to find Marcus standing beside the black sport utility vehicle at exactly that moment. Officer Daniel Hayes watched the approaching man carefully, still unaware of why everyone near the corporate entrance seemed to recognize him immediately. Several campus security officers quietly straightened their posture as he passed. Department managers waiting outside the headquarters respectfully stepped aside, allowing him a clear path toward the damaged vehicle. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing since the beginning of the encounter, the electronic key fob resting loosely in the palm of his hand. His calm never wavered. He simply waited as though every second had unfolded according to a schedule known only to him. Daniel glanced once more through the broken driver's side window. The leather portfolio remained untouched on the center console beside the company access badge. Despite the damaged glass scattered across the driver's seat and pavement, nothing else inside the vehicle appeared disturbed. "You knew someone important was coming," Daniel said quietly. Marcus answered with complete honesty. "Yes. You also knew exactly when." Marcus nodded. "The meeting has always been scheduled for 9:30. Daniel looked toward the digital clock inside the vehicle. It had just changed to exactly 9:30. Marcus gently closed his hand around the electronic key fob without making any sudden movement. "Everything is right on time," he said softly. The executive finally reached them and smiled warmly at Marcus before extending his hand. "Good morning, Marcus. Thank you for waiting." Marcus returned the handshake respectfully. "Good morning, sir. Everything is ready." Daniel listened carefully. The familiarity between the two men was impossible to miss. This was not a chance encounter. It was clearly an expected meeting interrupted by circumstances neither of them had planned. The executive glanced briefly at the damaged driver's side window before returning his attention to Marcus. "I see the morning became more eventful than expected." Marcus answered without the slightest trace of resentment. "Only a misunderstanding, sir." The executive nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate your patience." Daniel stepped forward respectfully. "Sir, I am Officer Daniel Hayes with the Dallas Police Department. I responded to a report concerning this vehicle." The executive smiled courteously and extended his hand. "Thank you for responding, officer." Daniel accepted the handshake. "I apologize if this has caused any inconvenience." The executive answered calmly. "You were performing your responsibility. That is always important." His measured tone immediately lowered the remaining tension around the parking area. Employees who had quietly gathered nearby relaxed as the conversation remained respectful and professional. Several people who had been recording with their phones slowly lowered them, realizing the situation was becoming a lesson rather than a confrontation. The executive turned back toward Marcus. "Do you still have the keys?" Marcus opened his hand and revealed the electronic key fob. "Yes, sir." "Excellent." Marcus held the keys out, but waited until the executive reached for them. Every movement reflected deliberate professionalism. Daniel quietly observed the exchange. He suddenly realized Marcus had never attempted to prove anything about himself. He had never argued. He had never tried to impress anyone. He had simply protected the responsibility entrusted to him while allowing the truth to arrive in its own time. The executive accepted the key fob with a grateful smile before looking once more at the damaged driver's side window. His expression remained composed. "We will take care of the vehicle," he said calmly. "The important thing is that everyone now understands why Marcus was here." Daniel looked from Marcus to the executive, sensing that within the next few moments the full explanation of the morning would finally be revealed. The executive accepted the electronic key fob from Marcus Brooks with a grateful nod before turning toward Officer Daniel Hayes. For a brief moment, the quiet parking area seemed to hold its breath. Employees standing near the entrance watched with growing curiosity while campus security officers exchanged knowing glances. Whatever uncertainty had filled the morning was beginning to disappear. The executive reached into the inside pocket of his tailored navy jacket and removed a black leather credential holder. He opened it slowly, allowing Daniel to clearly read the identification inside. Daniel's eyes moved across the polished company credentials before returning to the executive's face. His expression immediately changed. Standing before him was Richard Lawson, the head of security responsible for the entire Northgate corporate security campus. Daniel instinctively straightened his posture. "Mr. Lawson," he said respectfully. Richard smiled warmly. "Good morning, Officer Hayes." The small crowd quietly murmured as several employees recognized the credential from where they stood. A few who had been recording lowered their phones, realizing the situation had become something entirely different from what they first believed. Richard looked toward Marcus with complete confidence. "Thank you for protecting the schedule exactly as we discussed." Marcus nodded. "Everything remained on time, sir." Richard held up the electronic key fob. "This vehicle has been assigned to my office for executive transportation and security operations. Marcus has worked with our department for years and was asked to bring it here this morning before our quarterly security readiness inspection." Daniel listened carefully while replaying every conversation in his mind. Marcus had never claimed the vehicle belonged to him. He had only said he was responsible for it. Every answer had been truthful. Daniel had simply filled the unanswered spaces with his own assumptions. Richard continued calmly. "The repeated phone calls you saw were from me. I knew Marcus would already be waiting outside, but I wanted to confirm our timing before the inspection team arrived." Marcus smiled slightly. "I chose not to answer because I believed remaining beside the vehicle was the better decision." Richard nodded with visible approval. "Exactly the decision I hoped you would make." Daniel quietly looked through the damaged driver's side window once more. The leather portfolio resting on the center console suddenly made perfect sense. Richard noticed his attention. Inside that portfolio are today's security inspection reports and executive access documents. They were scheduled to be reviewed at 9:30 exactly. Daniel slowly exhaled. The entire sequence of events finally aligned. The parked vehicle, the waiting, the repeated glances at the clock, the unanswered calls. The untouched documents. Nothing had ever been suspicious. It had simply been a carefully planned assignment interrupted by an incorrect conclusion. Richard glanced briefly at the damaged window before returning his attention to Daniel. His voice remained calm and professional. "Officer Hayes, I appreciate that you responded when someone reported unusual activity. Public safety depends on officers who take reports seriously." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Thank you, sir." Richard continued with the same measured tone. At the same time, every situation deserves enough patience for the complete picture to emerge. Responsibility is strongest when it is guided by both caution and understanding. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at Marcus. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology. You answered every question honestly, and I still assumed there was something wrong because I reached a conclusion before I had all the facts." Marcus met his eyes with the same calm dignity he had carried since the beginning of the morning. "Thank you, officer. We all see only part of a story at first." Those simple words settled quietly over the parking lot. Employees began returning to their offices. Security officers resumed their patrol routes. The ordinary rhythm of the campus slowly returned. Richard placed one hand gently on the roof of the luxury sport utility vehicle before looking toward the headquarters entrance. "We should begin the inspection," he said. Marcus nodded once and picked up the leather portfolio through the open window with careful hands, ready to continue the responsibility he had been trusted to complete from the very beginning. Marcus Brooks carefully lifted the leather portfolio through the open driver's side window, making certain that none of the remaining glass shifted onto the documents inside. Richard Lawson watched with quiet approval before turning once more toward Officer Daniel Hayes. The atmosphere that had been tense only minutes earlier had transformed into one of thoughtful reflection. Employees who had paused to witness the encounter gradually resumed their morning routines, while the campus security officers returned to their assigned posts. The Northgate Corporate Security Campus once again reflected the orderly professionalism for which it was known. Daniel remained standing beside the damaged sport utility vehicle, his attention fixed on Marcus. "May I ask you something?" he said respectfully. Marcus nodded. "Of course. When you saw everything happening this morning, why did you stay so calm?" Marcus considered the question before answering. "Because becoming frustrated would not have changed the facts. My responsibility was to protect the assignment, not my pride." Daniel quietly reflected on those words. Throughout the entire encounter, Marcus had never raised his voice, never challenged the officer's authority, and never attempted to embarrass anyone. He had simply trusted that the truth would eventually arrive on its own. Richard gently closed the leather credential holder before placing it back inside his jacket. "That is exactly why Marcus has earned the confidence of our entire security division," he explained. "Professionalism is measured most clearly when circumstances become difficult." Daniel nodded with genuine respect. "I understand that now." Richard looked toward the damaged driver's side window before speaking again. "The vehicle can be repaired. Glass can always be replaced. Trust takes much longer to rebuild." The statement settled quietly over the parking area. Marcus glanced briefly at the damaged window before returning his attention to Richard. "The inspection should not be delayed because of this." Richard smiled. "I expected you to say that." Holding the portfolio securely under one arm, Marcus walked around the front of the sport utility vehicle and stood beside Richard, waiting for his next instruction. Neither man appeared interested in extending the conversation any further than necessary. Their priority remained the assignment that had brought them there in the first place. Daniel watched them with growing admiration. He realized that real leadership was being demonstrated in front of him without anyone trying to impress an audience. Richard turned toward him one final time. "Officer Hayes, thank you for remaining professional after learning the complete situation." Daniel answered honestly. "I appreciate the opportunity to understand what really happened." Richard nodded. "Every day presents an opportunity to strengthen judgment. The willingness to learn is one of the greatest qualities any professional can possess." Daniel accepted the words with quiet gratitude. Nearby, one of the campus security supervisors approached Richard and informed him that the executive inspection team had assembled inside the headquarters conference room. Richard thanked him before looking toward Marcus. "We are ready." Marcus handed him the portfolio. "Everything inside is organized according to today's schedule." Richard accepted it with complete confidence. "Exactly as I expected." The two men began walking toward the headquarters entrance together. As they crossed the parking area, employees greeted them with familiar smiles and respectful nods. It was obvious that Marcus was not simply a visitor. He belonged there. Daniel remained beside his patrol vehicle, watching until they reached the entrance. He replayed every decision from the morning in careful detail, recognizing how easily assumptions could shape an entire situation before the evidence had a chance to speak. He quietly opened the incident log on the computer inside his patrol vehicle and began documenting the encounter with complete accuracy. Every statement reflected facts instead of conclusions. Every observation remained objective. Before submitting the report, he paused for a brief moment and looked once more toward the headquarters entrance where Marcus and Richard had disappeared inside. For the first time that morning, he understood that the strongest measure of professionalism was never found in how quickly someone acted. It was found in how carefully they chose to understand the people standing before them. The executive security inspection concluded just before noon, and the Northgate corporate security campus returned to its familiar rhythm of quiet efficiency. Employees moved confidently between buildings, delivery vehicles followed scheduled routes, and visitors checked in through the reception desk without noticing the damaged sport utility vehicle that had already been moved to the maintenance garage for repairs. Inside the headquarters conference room, Richard Lawson thanked the inspection team for their professionalism before walking with Marcus Brooks toward the executive lobby. Neither man mentioned the events from earlier that morning. Their attention remained focused on the responsibilities still waiting to be completed. Marcus carried an empty leather portfolio beneath one arm after delivering every document exactly where it belonged. Richard glanced toward him with a satisfied smile. Everything stayed on schedule despite the interruption. Marcus answered quietly. The schedule mattered more than the misunderstanding. Richard nodded. That way of thinking is exactly why I continue trusting you with assignments that require patience. Marcus accepted the compliment with his usual humility. Trust is easiest to protect when you remember it belongs to someone else before it belongs to you. Richard smiled, recognizing the quiet wisdom behind those words. Outside, Officer Daniel Hayes remained in his patrol vehicle, completing the final details of his incident report. He carefully reviewed every sentence before submitting it, making certain that every observation reflected only verified facts. There were no exaggerated conclusions and no unnecessary assumptions. The report described a misunderstanding that had been resolved professionally by everyone involved. After transmitting the report, Daniel received a brief radio call from his field supervisor requesting a routine status update. Daniel summarized the incident honestly, explaining how the situation had unfolded and how the complete facts became clear only after Richard arrived. His supervisor listened quietly before offering a simple response. Thank you for handling the resolution professionally. Every encounter teaches something if we are willing to learn from it. Daniel acknowledged the message before ending the transmission. Those words stayed with him long after the radio became silent. A few minutes later, he noticed Marcus leaving the headquarters carrying only his jacket while Richard accompanied him toward the visitor parking area. Daniel stepped out of his patrol vehicle and walked over before they reached the sidewalk. Marcus greeted him with the same calm expression that had never changed throughout the day. Daniel extended his hand respectfully. Mr. Brooks, I wanted to thank you personally. Marcus accepted the handshake. For what? Daniel answered without hesitation. For showing me more patience than I deserved this morning. Marcus smiled gently. You were doing your job. Daniel shook his head slightly. I was performing my duty, but I was not seeing the entire situation. There is an important difference. Richard quietly observed the conversation without interrupting. Marcus looked at Daniel for a brief moment before replying. Experience will continue teaching all of us. The important part is deciding whether we listen. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. I intend to remember today for a long time. Richard finally spoke. That is the value of reflection. Mistakes become lessons only after we choose to understand them. The three men stood together for a quiet moment beneath the warm Texas sunlight, while employees continued walking past without paying much attention. The excitement from earlier had faded completely. What remained was something much more valuable than public attention. It was mutual respect. Daniel wished both men a safe afternoon before returning to his patrol vehicle. Marcus and Richard walked toward another company vehicle waiting near the executive entrance. continuing their conversation about upcoming security projects, as though the morning misunderstanding had already become part of the past. Watching them leave, Daniel realized that real authority had never been demonstrated through titles, expensive vehicles, or executive positions. It had been revealed through calm decisions, respectful words, honest responsibility, and the quiet confidence to let truth arrive without forcing it. That lesson stayed with him long after the parking lot returned to complete silence. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the Northgate corporate security campus as the final meetings of the day came to an end. Employees gathered their laptops, security personnel completed routine patrol reports, and visitors gradually departed through the main entrance. The pace slowed, yet the lesson carried by the morning's unexpected misunderstanding continued quietly through the people who had witnessed it. Inside his office overlooking the campus, Richard Lawson reviewed the last security report before placing it neatly inside a cabinet. He glanced through the window toward the parking area where the damaged sport utility vehicle had already been taken for repair. The broken glass had been swept away, the parking space had been cleaned, and nothing remained to suggest that only a few hours earlier dozens of people had gathered there in uncertainty. Richard smiled slightly, appreciating how quickly physical damage could disappear while meaningful lessons often remained for years. Marcus Brooks stood near the office door waiting for the final instructions before leaving for the day. Richard closed the file and looked toward him. "You handled today exactly as I hoped you would." Marcus answered with quiet humility. "I simply completed the responsibility you trusted me to carry." Richard nodded. "Many people protect their reputation first. You protected the assignment first." Marcus considered the observation before replying. "Reputation usually follows responsibility when responsibility comes first." Richard laughed softly. "That explains why everyone who works with you continues asking for your help." Marcus smiled but offered no further comment. Recognition had never been his goal. Reliability had. Across town, Officer Daniel Hayes continued his afternoon patrol through downtown Dallas. Every routine traffic stop and every conversation with members of the public felt slightly different than they had only a few hours earlier. He found himself listening longer before speaking and asking one additional question before reaching any conclusion. The change was subtle, but it was real. During a brief stop at a neighborhood convenience store, an elderly man struggling to load several heavy boxes into the trunk of his sedan caught Daniel's attention. Without hesitation, he walked over and offered assistance. The grateful smile he received reminded him that public service was built just as much on ordinary moments of kindness as it was on responding to emergencies. After returning to his patrol vehicle, Daniel quietly reflected on the morning once more. He realized that Marcus had never tried to win an argument because he never viewed the encounter as a contest. He trusted facts more than emotion. That quiet confidence had ultimately carried greater influence than any raised voice ever could. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Marcus left the corporate campus and paused briefly before getting into another company vehicle assigned for his trip home. Several employees crossing the parking lot recognized him and offered friendly waves. One young security trainee approached with genuine admiration. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for everything you do here." Marcus smiled warmly. "Just remember that professionalism begins long before anyone notices it." The trainee nodded thoughtfully, clearly intending to remember those words. Richard watched the brief conversation from the entrance before returning inside the building. He understood that true leadership was never measured only by protecting facilities or managing security operations. It was measured by helping people grow through everyday experiences. Meanwhile, Daniel completed the final hour of his shift with renewed perspective. The city around him remained busy, filled with thousands of strangers whose stories he could never fully know from first impressions alone. As he drove beneath the warm Texas sunset, he quietly promised himself that every future encounter would begin not with assumptions, but with patience. Somewhere across the city, Marcus continued toward home with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the entire day. The assignment had ended exactly as planned. The misunderstanding had been resolved with dignity, and every person involved had left with something more valuable than they possessed that morning. Some carried documents. Some carried responsibility. Others carried wisdom. All of them carried the quiet reminder that respect becomes strongest when it is offered before the truth has finished introducing itself. Evening settled gently across Dallas as the final rays of sunlight reflected from the glass towers surrounding the Northgate corporate security campus. The repaired sport utility vehicle rested quietly in its assigned parking space, looking no different from any other executive vehicle on the property. The broken window had already been replaced, the scattered glass had long been cleaned away, and the visible signs of the morning had disappeared. Yet for the people whose paths had crossed that parking lot, the memory remained far clearer than the polished surface of the vehicle itself. Marcus Brooks finished one final conversation with the facilities manager before gathering his jacket and preparing to leave for the evening. As he walked through the lobby, reception staff, security officers, and maintenance employees greeted him with genuine respect. He returned every greeting with the same calm smile that had carried him through the entire day. Nothing about his manner suggested he believed he had won anything. In his mind, there had never been a contest. There had only been a responsibility to complete with professionalism and dignity. Richard Lawson watched Marcus leave through the front entrance before turning toward the executive security team assembled nearby. "Today reminded all of us why procedures matter," he said calmly. "But it also reminded us that judgment is never complete until we understand the entire situation." Every member of the team nodded in agreement. The lesson extended beyond security policies. It reached something far more important. It reminded every professional in the room that respect should never depend upon appearance, clothing, a vehicle, or assumptions made during the first few moments of an encounter. Across the city, Officer Daniel Hayes parked his patrol vehicle at the precinct after completing his shift. Before heading home, he remained seated for a few quiet minutes reviewing the events of the day and his thoughts. He realized that the most important part of his uniform had never been the badge pinned above his heart. It was the responsibility to treat every person with fairness before reaching conclusions. That realization would influence every conversation he had from that day forward. As he walked into the station, another officer asked how his shift had gone. Daniel smiled thoughtfully before answering. "I learned that patience can reveal facts faster than assumptions ever will." His colleague looked curious, but Daniel simply nodded and continued inside, carrying the lesson with him instead of trying to explain it in a few short sentences. Some experiences could not be measured by paperwork alone. They changed the way a person viewed every future decision. Later that evening, Marcus arrived home and placed his jacket neatly beside the front door. The assignment had ended exactly as promised. The documents had been delivered on time. The inspection had been completed successfully. The trust placed in him had been honored from beginning to end. He looked out through the living room window for a quiet moment before closing the curtains, grateful not because the day had been easy, but because integrity had remained stronger than misunderstanding. Somewhere else in the city, Richard prepared for another busy day waiting tomorrow, confident that the people surrounding him continued proving why character remained the strongest foundation of leadership. The damaged window would eventually be forgotten. The schedule would become another completed entry on a calendar. The vehicle would continue serving its purpose without attracting another glance. Yet the lesson would remain with everyone involved. Long after titles were forgotten and expensive vehicles became ordinary objects, people would still remember the quiet man who answered every question with honesty, the officer willing to reflect instead of defend his pride, and the leader who chose understanding over humiliation. Because real authority is never measured by the power to command attention. It is measured by the wisdom to extend respect before demanding it. In the end, the strongest security anyone can provide is not protecting a building, a vehicle, or a document. It is protecting the dignity of every person before the full truth has the opportunity to speak for itself.